Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast, and others of you are joining us on our digital platforms. I'm Tanisha Sullivan, your host. Tonight, the 70th anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education. On May 17, 1954, in a unanimous decision, the United States Supreme Court issued a ruling intended to end racial segregation in public schools across the country. This landmark case not only impacted education, it was a defining moment in a transformative civil rights movement across the United States. And here in Boston, it would take nearly 20 years for the Boston Public Schools to integrate, notably by court order and not choice. That put Boston center stage on this national issue. The decision to desegregate schools through busing in Boston and other jurisdictions across the country was a controversial decision then and now, but it was often a solution of last resort. Has Brown delivered on its promise of quality public education for all children? And what are the most pressing education challenges facing Black children today? Joining us tonight to discuss, Erika Richmond Walton is a litigation fellow at the Lawyers for Civil Rights in Boston. Ronald Mitchell is the co-owner, editor, and publisher of the Bay State Banner. Devin Morris is the co-founder and executive director of The Teacher's Lounge, a nonprofit organization with the mission of diversifying the people, thoughts, and actions of the educational workforce in the greater Boston area and beyond. And Philip Martin, a senior investigative reporter for GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to this conversation. Brown was such a significant decision and impacted the lives of so many people across the country, not just Black, but all of us. And so I'm excited for this conversation, and let's jump right on into it. Devin, has Brown delivered on its promise?
First of all, thank you for having me. And no, it hasn't. Brown promised access to resources and diversity. And what we're seeing now is that our student population are the most diverse that they've ever been in U.S. history, and yet our schools are still segregated. The access to resources are still impacted by the redlining of our days past. And what we're seeing is that 60% of Black and Latinx students attend schools that are 75% students of color. And there's a huge resource gap, somewhere in the mark of $23 billion compared to our predominantly Black and brown schools compared to our predominantly white schools across the country. And so I would say no. But I think another piece that doesn't get talked about enough when we talk about the impact of Brown is how it led to the erasure of Black teachers. And this is of great significance when we talk about a time period now where we are in a teacher shortage. We are fighting for teacher diversity. We're fighting for the retention of Black and brown educators who have already chosen a profession that we have every reason to run kicking and screaming from. And how we talk about the impact of this good intention but poorly executed court case and its impact on our babies and our educators is something that needs to be taught more in our K through 12 education systems, but more importantly, it actually needs to be taught more in our teacher prep programs. How do we think about the purpose-driven work that we're doing if we don't have the full historical context, and particularly in a city like Boston?
Why is that historical context important?
Yeah. Being in a teacher shortage that we're in, and when we think about the extent to which Black and brown students are being pushed out of our K through 12 education systems, we're asking those same students to come back to traumatic experiences to now come back and teach, right, and pay it forward. And so when we have a Classroom Leaders of Color Fellowship where we are developing early career educators of color and pairing them with veteran educators of color, OGs in the game, to talk about the hidden curriculum, to talk about sort of how to survive and thrive in a predominantly white profession. part of this purpose exploration is necessary to have the historical context of a city like Boston, an understanding of the implications of Brown v. Board as it roots us in the radical act of teaching that we are doing day in and day out, and understand how important our presence is and how, for how long we have been pushed out of a system that we need to be present for our babies. And our babies need to see what we call mirrors and windows. Mm-hmm. They need to see themselves reflected and new perspectives reflected in the profession if we're going to actualize the reality of Brown's promise.
Thank you for that. I actually want to pick up on something you mentioned. You said you talked about good intention, poor execution. Yeah. And on that, I want to go, Philip, to you. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about, kind of from a historical standpoint, kind of the timing of Brown? And, you know, one of the things, and Professor Ogletree, you know, wrote a whole book on it, right? You know, the court said that this decision that schools should be desegregated with all deliberate speed.
Right. All deliberate speed was the addendum to Brown v. Board, essentially, that added a year later after Brown v. Board. But it was interpreted by those who were against any form of desegregation as a way of delaying, as long as they wanted, the implementation of desegregation. Mm-hmm. It proved to be a problematic phrase, all deliberate speed, precisely because it allowed for Southerners, particularly, including a group of senators, to formulate a way of delaying implementation of desegregation throughout. And we also saw that it manifested in it helped this extraordinary backlash to Brown v. Board 1954. The backlash manifested in a lot of ways. We saw it with in some of the most horrific ways, the killing of civil rights leaders, for example, throughout the South. It also led, of course, to to black leaders trying to expedite this in any way they could, which led, of course, to the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and the Voting Rights Acts 64, 65. But at the same time, massive backlash. And this backlash was a continuum. It was not something that simply manifested in ebbs and flows, but you saw a backlash in the context of the Bakke decision, mm-hmm. for example, a legal decision by a medical student a medical student who challenged affirmative action in the 1970s, won his case. You saw this with Boston, of course, in 1974, the resistance to desegregation in Boston. Boston was like the most pivotal case of many that occurred after Brown v. Board. Detroit was another one. Louisville was another one in order to try to desegregate the schools. But you always saw backlash.
Yes.
There was always backlash. At the current moment, we're seeing a massive backlash where, as Devin said, the schools have largely been resegregated. Those that were that did experience some desegregation have been resegregated, and you actually have a clarion call from far-right conservatives who are now painting the moment as a backlash against white people.
Yes.
Where you have people like Stephen Miller with the American Legal First Foundation, who is saying that those who are actually suffering in our society are white people. And you have Donald Trump echoing this at this moment. And so they are therefore unleashing unprecedented attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, both in policy and in ideals.
So I want to go there, but before I go there, I want to pick up on something you said. You made specific reference to resistance in the South.
That's right.
And, you know, I am a Bostonian through and through. Love the city. Howsoever, as they say.
Right.
The resistance was not just in the South.
Oh, no.
Very clearly, as noted. It took 20 years for Boston Public Schools to actually desegregate, and it was by force. So, Ron, could you talk a little bit about, just from a sentiment standpoint, what was the general sentiment around education and public education here in Boston around that time?
Well, when the Brown v. Board ruling came out, folks in the black community have always cherished education. It's very important to us. We understand it's the upliftment. It's the tool that can level the playing field for families, communities overall. So when the ruling first came out, there was a great hope that there would be a lot of change. But as we all know, it took over 20 years up south here in Boston to get a ruling that then forced physical segregation. Now, a lot of the black community, we weren't really excited about having our children bused across town, but we understood that to level the playing field, we had to take other people, put them in our situation, allow them to understand the imbalance before we could hope for better. But as it's been said today, even now, because of redlining and a whole host of other things, and the clock slowly being turned back against desegregation, we now have still a very segregated educational system. Some by just sheer demographics, the redlining of communities that didn't allow folks to move and spread the diversity of the neighborhood around. There's still a lot of segregation in our public education. I also think that folks, and black folks especially, still want to make sure that in the higher education systems, where we now see DEI being, affirmative action being turned back and the clock on affirmative action being turned back, we and educators around the country are still looking hard to figure out ways to increase black participation in higher education, despite the fact that affirmative action has been reversed. And the challenges are states like California and Michigan, where they've tried other things, economic-based benefits and all those things, those particular tactics or tools or approaches haven't really worked. So I think that there's still educators around the country and the black community overall just looking to say, hey, we know there's an imbalance. We still see it. We see it in high school. We see it in higher education. And our country has always said we're here to balance the playing field, to live up to, what we owe our communities, all communities. So I think that there's still a challenge in that area.
So, Erika, when we think about the movement, the civil rights movement, oftentimes Brown is centered. It was certainly a pivotal moment in the movement. It's often centered, but what folks don't realize sometimes is that there was a long road to Brown. We were talking earlier, the Sarah Roberts case here in Boston was the very first case in the country.
100 years earlier.
100 years earlier, challenging segregation in public schools. And there were a series of cases brought by Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund leading up to Brown, paving the way. Brown happened. And then, as Philip mentioned, there have been a series of civil rights cases that have come after. Can you talk a little bit about where we are today in the civil rights movement, specifically as it relates to education?
Right. So we've talked about InterSchool segregation, and we like to think of Massachusetts as this liberal bastion, but children are also experiencing InterSchool segregation.
Okay, what is that?
So InterSchool segregation we see it in the achievement gap. Black and brown children are achieving at lower rates than white children. We also see it in Black and brown children are underrepresented in AP classes and gifted and talented programs, but they're overrepresented in special education programs. We also see it in the ways that Black and brown children are disciplined as opposed to white children.
Okay.
So Black and brown children are more likely to be suspended or expelled. They are also more likely to be physically restrained. Last year, I represented a third grader who was handcuffed by the police. He was dragged out in front of his mother, placed in an ambulance, had his arms and legs restrained, taken to the adult psychiatric ward, and only after it was determined that he was not a danger to himself or others that he was finally released to his mother. And so children are suffering both academically but emotionally, because even though he is now out of that situation, he is still suffering from some residual trauma from that.
So when we think about, so we have over the course of time, and I want to go back to Ron hit the nail on the head when he talked about just education, the power of education, the importance of education to all communities, but specifically the Black community. We've always seen education as the pathway to freedom, a pathway to freedom, a critical pathway to freedom. And so what I'm hearing you talk about is we may have today, it may not be legal to have segregated schools by intention, but there are ways in which schools are still being segregated.
Absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about, and I'd love to hear from everyone, I want to start with Erika, how do we address that today?
We address it by continuing to talk about these issues like we're doing right now. We address them by what we do at Lawyers for Civil Rights, by legal action. We also do community education at Lawyers for Civil Rights, and also encouraging families to stand up for themselves and to speak up when these things happen to them.
I think one of the tragedies of the rollback of DEI in education is that one of the main tools of DEI when it was first introduced in the public and private school systems was to educate white teachers as to their own biases and in their teaching approaches how they could better teach students of color. And now with that DEI being rolled back, the challenges that you're talking about where a white teacher who doesn't understand or has their own internal prejudices, intentional or not, will treat a child of color. I have two college-age, young men now who are in college, but I saw it through high school in very good school systems and in private school as well, public and private, that, some of their teachers, you would just have to sit down with them and explain to them, listen, we see the imbalance, and you're not going to be allowed to treat my child that way. And I think that as DEI is rolled back, the educational benefit for all teachers is being diminished, and that's a damage to our children, and that's something we have to be aware of.
Devin.
Yeah.
I want to go to you on this.
How much time we got?
I know. I felt it.
So, two things. A mantra that we live by at the Teachers Lounge is nothing about us without us is for us. And it was coined in South African ability rights campaign, but we use it often when we're talking about if you want to impact change, those, as our Congresswoman Presley would say, those closest to the pain need to be closest to the power. So what you're talking about is advocacy. You're talking about self-advocacy within a school building, but we need it on a larger scale. Brown v. Board was good intention, poor application, right? But it was because what we rushed to do was not include the voices of those who we were seeking to support. Black voices, Black students, Black families, and Black educators were not a part of the process of the implementation. And so we need to talk about that first and foremost. And I think what most folks would say is that one solution that would come out of this is if you can draw red lines on a map 70 plus years ago, then you can do it again today. And we can redistrict. There's a newamerica.org has this interactive map that not only shows the disparity from district to district, but specifically bordering districts and the wealth gap and the resource gap between bordering districts and how segregated these neighboring districts can be. We're seeing resegregation happening where across the U.S. Communities are creating new districts within districts, which is just another form of segregation. So we have to have an approach that looks at how do we distribute the wealth and resources appropriately across the districts that currently exist and think about what redistricting could look like.
I like that. I also wonder what folks think about rethinking how we fund public education, right? Because that there too is a challenge, right? By design, the way these schools are funded. Anyone want to weigh in on that?
Well, property taxes have their limitations because of the very districting that we're talking about. You have segregated districts that basically target, obviously, their own community. If they're already segregated, you're not bringing in other people who could benefit from this. I think that there were some ideas around busing, desegregation in the 1970s that actually made sense, that were basically made moot by the Supreme Court, however, and district courts. There was the Detroit model, which would basically expanded busing programs to the suburbs. And so therefore you had resource allocation that would be more fairly distributed.
But isn't that that's like Meco?
Well, that was like Meco, but Meco was a voluntary program, and this would have been mandated. And that program was going to be emulated by Boston, but again, it was invalidated. Boston and Detroit, there was a lot of trade-offs in terms of the possible. That's right, techniques. And what people always have to remember, this wasn't about sitting next to a white kid that was going to make a black kid smarter.
That's right.
This was about resource allocation.
In a perfect world, I think there were black families that would have been happy to just spread the money around and leave the children leave my children in the local school and give us the same amount of resources. But that, obviously, as we know, was totally unrealistic.
The harm of Brown was never all black schools with black teachers. It was how an education system deemed us as inferior and how it deemed our education as inferior. Gloria Ladson-Billings talks about how there were all black schools that were outperforming some of our white counterparts, but there was no platform that elevated this, and we were still lacking resources. And so I love what you're saying. I think the thing that I'm proposing in terms of redistricting is a step in a direction, but not the solution.
Right.
I worry Meco, if you talk to Meco students who will talk about how they then had access to resources, but if we're shipping or busing our black students out to predominantly white schools where the teachers are not loving, caring, and supporting for our babies in the ways in which those with shared identities are doing, it creates different set of harm. So it's not the lack of resources that, we're gaining access to the resources, but at what cost? And so I think it needs to be a multi-pronged approach. And I think that there are phases to it. But I think you're absolutely correct in terms of saying that we need to rethink how we fund public education. In the interim, I think that the short term is if you redistrict and say that these neighboring towns or areas that have such large wealth gaps, if they are now bucketed together and sharing those resources and spreading it more equitably, I think it's a step in the right direction, though not the final solution.
Sort of stitching it together is what you're saying. Yeah.
So the funding piece has consistently been a challenge. I think here in Massachusetts we have an interesting opportunity and challenge because there is a constitutional right, right, to public education here in Massachusetts that doesn't exist in other parts of the country. How might we think about leveraging, and I know from a legal standpoint there's been much discussion and debate on this, how might we think about leveraging really the constitutional right that exists here at the state level around public education?
In terms of funding? In terms of funding,
or more generally in terms of providing greater access and opportunity for black children and other children of color.
Right. I mean, that is actually something that I'm looking at doing in terms of trying to get equal resources to enable districts to be able to rebuild their schools, and looking at it in the context of the right to education and how that works. And there is some case law around that relating to school funding and the right to education that, gives the Commonwealth the duty in, fulfilling their obligation to that right to education, to provide that funding.
I think I'd love to hear as we kind of begin to wrap up tonight's program from each of you, looking forward, what is your hope for public education, specifically here in Massachusetts, for our children?
Well, my greatest hope is that Massachusetts figures out a way to spread the educational wealth and to spread the resources evenly.
Perfect.
Because
I'm going to move to Philip on that.
Pretty much the same.
Okay.
I think you need we still have the courts, a fairly liberal court in Massachusetts. on the national basis, the federal court, the Supreme Court, I think that's over. You have a super conservative majority. You will never see a Brown v. Board with this type of structure that we have on the court at the moment. So I think state by state, we have to basically depend on the courts to, in part, not entirely, because it's also community based, but in the courts in order to deliver resource decisions that advantage.
I'm going to Devin.
Right.
Just look at what happened.
I'm going to Devin.
To not build on, but I agree. We are fighting for the Educator Diversity Act with support from and leadership from Latinos for Education and a number of other organizations to increase accountability, resources, and support to recruit and retain more educators of color. And so even if we do these other initiatives that similar to Meco, we have more representation across our schools, across the
board. Final word, Erika.
And my hope is that Black and brown children will stop suffering harm in schools, that academic harm, that emotional harm, and that, Black and brown children are able to go to school in the suburbs and
that's our show. That is the end of our broadcast and the end of our show. I want to thank all of our guests and thank you for watching. But now stay with us as we continue our conversation on our digital platforms, YouTube and Facebook. I'm Tanisha Sullivan, your host. We are on YouTube and Facebook with our post show, continuing our discussion on the 70th anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education. We've got a lot more to talk about. We've got a whole another show. I'm just saying. But I do want to go back to the conversation around teachers and our educators and the educator shortage and how that's impacting specifically Black educators.
Yeah. So we covered this a little bit, but Brown took a mathematical approach to a social problem, right? You are not solving the issue solely by, and to your point, the goal was never just to put Black students next to white students. And what came out of that was the erasure and loss of, give me the number again.
100,000.
100,000.
Principals and teachers.
Principals and teachers. But also the advocacy organizations that supported us also went away. And so all of that matters today as we are currently in a teacher shortage. We've never seen Garrity order lived out here in Boston in an approach to recruit and retain more Black and brown educators. And that has great significance on the impact on our babies. If we don't see ourselves represented happy, healthy, and thriving educators of color, particularly Black educators in our classrooms, why would our babies ever think of this as a viable profession? Why would they want to return to a crime scene where we are often pushed out ourselves? And so we have to start here in thinking about the long-term implications of Brown v. Board in trying to ensure that we are recruiting and retaining more of us in the profession today for the sake of the long-term development of our pipeline.
And so I appreciate you mentioning that the Garrity order, which was the order that came from Morgan v. Hennigan, the desegregation case here in Boston, that it included teacher diversity because it was more than, it's important for people to know, it was more than just desegregating the schools. It was also about desegregating the profession, integrating the profession in a meaningful way. And so as you referenced, the Garrity order had some requirement thresholds that the district needed to meet as it related to the percentage of Black educators in the Boston public schools. What I do also want to pick up on there is when we talk about Black educators in the classroom, the impact that it can have on kind of the learning process, the fundamentals, literacy, math, but also the the socio-emotional impact that having a Black educator can have on a child. Can you talk, because you mentioned trauma. Right. And the trauma that children are experiencing today.
Well, the trauma that I mentioned was in relation to Black and brown children being placed in predominantly white situations, like with the Meco program we've talked about. And while it provides wonderful opportunities for children to go to some of the best schools in the Commonwealth, we're seeing that while laws, policies, Meco exists, mentalities have not changed, and the stereotypes relating to Black and brown children are still very pervasive in the schools and in the educators that they're being sent to. And that is causing the trauma, due to these unculturally competent environments.
I know that from being, familiar with Meco and having my aunt who ran Meco for many years, I know that Meco worked very hard to have folks on the ground in every school. And I think that it's not just Meco. I think it's school systems around the state overall that have the imbalance where some teachers are receptive and understanding and want to educate despite their preconceived notions or internal prejudices. And then there are teachers that, they're just there to do the job. Right. And I think that that's just true overall. I think that Meco does help and provides a good opportunity for many students. But the challenges that they have in the Meco program on the ground in these suburban schools are still there for folks of color who live in those neighborhoods, because there's still, large pockets of Black communities outside of Boston. And I think it's about educating the educators is the tool. And also the resources, we talked about it earlier on. We broke a story about Brockton, where a tremendous amount of divestment in the educational system had high school students sitting in the cafeteria for whole classes with no teachers. That type of an imbalance is something that, I'm not an attorney, but that, that opens up when you talk about our Commonwealth. Massachusetts has always been a state that cherished its education, higher education, MIT. More people are educated in New England than anywhere else in the world, in the Western world anyway, for higher education. But to have these kind of imbalances in our educational system was shocking to many folks. But that's the truth, and we have to hold the system accountable and require some type of, and I don't know the exact answer, but some type of redistribution of educational resources.
I also think another element to this story that's very important is housing. If we cannot talk about resource allocation, we're not talking about changing in housing laws, in loaning, in the type of redlining that still exists in our communities, albeit the statements by banks that redlining is something that's a thing of the past. We still see it manifest, throughout the region. And until we, so I think these things have to be attacked simultaneously. That they are symbiotic. That you have to have housing laws that benefit everyone, equitable housing laws. You have to change the pattern of banking regulation that basically still pushes out or makes it harder for Black and brown folk to get a loan for a house than it does for white Americans.
So this, and can you just pull up just a little higher, Philip, just to make sure that folks understand clearly the connection between housing and education, because you're spot on, but I want to make sure that everybody caught that.
Sure. Well, if you're living in a place like Newton, for example, the Garden City, one of the best school systems in the country, Newton North, Newton South, so on and so forth, you have a relatively small number of Black folk there because of it's a question of who goes to school there. And that's a question of who lives there. And so if you live there, you obviously can go to school there. If you can't even gain access to the community, then you are on the outside of one of the better schools priced out. Exactly. And you see this with Concord Carlisle. You see this with Lincoln Sudbury. You see it with and of course, it's also a matter of property taxes. And property taxes, with property taxes, you can pay for some great schools. And you can pay for a lot of things. And I think we also find a situation where some black Americans and brown Americans basically have chosen not to go into the education profession because they aren't paid enough. You know, if folks have been poor all their lives, and then they're being told, okay, we want you to go into teaching, and we're only going to pay you $38,000 a year. A lot of folks aren't going to opt for that. So you need to pay teachers. Teachers deserve to be paid the same way that consultants to Microsoft
arguably
and Google.
the most important job in the country.
It's the most important job in the country. I mean, when I think about black teachers, and I think about the reason I'm sitting in this chair right here, I think about Steve Chenault in Detroit. I think about Mr. Anderson in Detroit. I think about Ms. Harris. I think about black teachers who were formidable in my life. And so they have given so much to us. And there should be some level of reciprocity. And that begins with, again, the paying them enough to retain them and to bring them into the profession. And then, of course, again, to get back to the housing element, all these things are symbiotic. They have to work in sync.
Right. And going along with that, there's also disparities in appraisals.
That's
right. You take one house in the black community, it's worth $500,000. That same house in a white neighborhood is worth $1 million.
That's right.
And those property taxes.
Or even worse, the same house in the same neighborhood owned by a black person, when appraised, is appraised 20, 30% less in value than the very same house. That's the way they say, and most realtors will tell you, take all your black photos off the wall, take everything that tells it's a black person's home when they show it, because they're concerned with it being devalued.
So
that's a tragedy.
One of the things that I want to also get your thoughts around when we're talking about education and just kind of foundational public education. We know Massachusetts is touted as having one of the best public school systems in the country.
For some.
And then we often say number one for some. And consistently, this seems to be intractable problem that we have is really reaching our black and brown babies, specifically around literacy.
That's right.
How do we tackle that? Certainly, we've got children are in classrooms, there's out of school time, but if we're really going to fulfill the promise of Brown, I think that this literacy issue, this literacy crisis we have in Massachusetts must be addressed.
Well, I think that the state has taken some major steps in early education, in supporting early education. And I think that's where it starts. You know, my mom was a kindergarten, first grade teacher. And I think that even prior to kindergarten, we have to provide educational opportunities for all communities, irregardless, irregardless economics. Because in the suburbs, these families have money to send their children to early education. In many schools in the inner city community, in economically developing communities, folks don't have those resources. People don't have those resources. And as a result of it, their children don't start out with that beginning education at a young enough age to really provide that foundation that they need. And that's really a challenge. But I do see the governor making some major steps, and Massachusetts as a state has made some major commitments, as well as our elected officials, to move early education forward. I think that's the beginning of a good step.
This is a national crisis. I think if we can figure out the solution here, and you won't find it with me, but I do believe that I'm going to keep riding the same horse of diversity of those in early education, diversity of texts that we're reading for our babies, them seeing themselves represented in literature plays a role. But what Ron's talking about is that early education is so necessary. There's a point at which in our babies' lives where they are learning how to read.
Yes.
And then there's a shift that happens where now you have to read in order to further your learning. And so what resources and the who we are placing in front of our babies at that pivotal stage of learning how to read that then dictates. I think I've always looked at this solely from a furthering your education standpoint. But folks like Leon Smith from Citizens for Juvenile Justice and some other advocates who will talk about the implication of literacy on carceral rates, on long-term success. And I don't think enough when I go back to how we prepare educators through these teacher prep programs that we are not telling our young teachers this direct correlation and how important it is to life outcomes for our babies, and particularly black students. And so these are the aspects that I would love to see shifted in our
I think also the notion of starting in daycare is so important. I mean, there is recognition, for example, among some immersion programs, Chinese immersion programs, Russian immersion programs, that you start very early, so on and so forth. But in order to do that, it requires funding.
That's right.
And so I think there has to be more funding dedicated to early childhood education, the earliest childhood education. A lot of that begins with taxpayer-funded daycare because so many black and brown parents cannot afford early daycare. It's super expensive.
It is imperative.
Yeah, and that's imperative. And I think there's a lot to be learned from programs, and not entirely, but in part from programs like Chinese immersion programs, so on and so forth. And the reason I say in part is because I don't think you need the whole caboodle.
Yeah.
I think there are things you can borrow from different cultures that basically work for others.
And some of the early Montessori schools.
Montessori schools,
those
exactly.
styles.
A piece that is happening here in Boston, and I would love to see it continue to grow. I don't know about you all. Me and just about every other child on my block was raised by my grandmother, right?
Yes.
She ran the local daycare. Everybody called her grandma. She was not trained formally through...
She didn't have a PhD in education?
Do you understand what I'm saying? But what I'm seeing now in the city of Boston is an effort to improve the resources, training, and development of those, even the mom and pops daycares.
That's right.
For the reasons that we're naming. If the resources aren't in our communities yet, then there's no reason that the city can't pour it into, ensure that black and brown babies are getting the access to those resources that we deserve at that early stage.
Absolutely. And so as we kind of march forward on the continuum of Brown, I certainly, picking up where we're ending, I certainly hope that we can focus more on the early childhood education, early childhood intervention, specifically around literacy. There's so much power in that. And if our children do not acquire the requisite literacy skills early on, there are so many consequences to that potentially. And so policy. Here in Massachusetts, there is policy that is being advanced around early childhood education. I certainly encourage folks to continue to advocate around the advancement of that legislation, and then also the funding. Ensuring that there is funding for early childhood education in communities across the Commonwealth, focusing on family daycare, in-home daycare. My mama was an in-home daycare provider too. Focusing on community-based programs that are culturally competent for our children.
Like the legendary Page Academy.
Like Page Academy, like Renaissance. So there are so many other programs that we can build upon. But the bottom line here is moving forward from Brown, literacy for our children. That is the end of our time together. I know. What a great discussion. We could keep going, but we are out of time. So I want to thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, our audience, for being with us. I'm Tanisha Sullivan. Have a good night.